From coast to coast, unlock adventure at Red Lion Hotels by Sonesta, where restful sleep, friendly service, and local knowledge await. Whether for business or pleasure, spend less and make more of every trip. When you sign up for the Sonesta Travel Pass, you'll get their best rates instantly. Go to Sonesta.com to book your stay and unlock their best rates with Sonesta Travel Pass. Here today, roam tomorrow. Join now at Sonesta.com. Terms and conditions apply.
With a detailed agent directory you won't find anywhere else, Homes.com is the only place to find the in-depth info home shoppers want. Very in-depth info. Looking for a listing agent's contact info? We've got it. The agent with the most sales in your price range? Easy. Specialized agents with all the up-to-date info on your dream neighborhood? We'll know them. A Pisces who enjoys long walks on the beach? You've got other sites for that.
Homes.com. We've done your homework.
You're listening to DNA ID, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, and Campus Killings. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
Over the 4.5 years that I've been doing DNA ID, many of you have asked for me to consult with an expert to provide some kind of insight as to the types of killers that IGG is flushing out. Longtime listeners might remember that very early on in the show, I spoke with Paul Holes about the advent of one-and-done killers. These are men who escaped detection for years because they killed only once and were not ever entered into the violent offender DNA databases. It is only thanks to IGG that they are now being exposed, after many of them lived, quote, normal lives for years. So today, I'm bringing you my conversation with Julia Cowley, former profiler with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit and host of the terrific podcast, The Consult. I sent Julia some synopses of the cases I thought epitomized these one-and-done killers, and we will discuss patterns, MOs, and other trends that Julia finds helpful in understanding this type of killer. All the cases are ones I've covered on DNA ID in the past. I recommend that you listen to the full episodes on these cases before listening to our discussion, as we will refer to details from those episodes. Here are the cases we'll be discussing. Lisa Ziegert. Lisa was killed in 1992 by Gary Shara, who confessed to her murder after he was arrested. Their relationship was unclear, although they were possibly acquainted. Lisa was abducted from the Western Massachusetts gift shop she was working at, probably at knife point. She was vaginally and anally raped and stabbed to death. She was left for dead in a clearing in the woods. Gary Shara was 24. Darlene Krashok was killed in 1987 by Michael White, who was a stranger, although he resided on the same military base and they possibly met at a bar. Darlene was a soldier stationed at Fort Carson in Colorado. She was found nude in a frozen parking lot at dawn. She had been vaginally and anally raped, beaten, bitten, punched in the face, bridled with a coat hanger, and strangled with a coat hanger garrote. Darlene was dumped from a vehicle, and the entire torture and murder possibly occurred in a van. Michael White was 26 years old. Michelle Martinko was killed in 1979 by Jerry Burns, who was arrested and convicted after a trial in a stranger crime of opportunity. 18-year-old Michelle was leaving the Westdale Mall in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, when she was attacked and stabbed to death in her car by Jerry Lynn Burns, someone she didn't know. Michelle was found partially on the floor of the front seat of her car, stabbed to death, and she had a severe head injury from being bludgeoned with an object on the side of her head, theorized to be the handle of a large knife. There was no evidence of rape or sexual assault, and Michelle was fully dressed. The killer was wearing gloves but stabbed himself during the frenzy. Burns was 25. Jean Childs was killed in 1993 by hockey dad Jerry Westrom in a transactional relationship of sex worker and John. Jean was found in her Minneapolis, Minnesota apartment, stabbed to death in an incredibly gruesome scene with blood everywhere. She was wearing only socks. She sustained 65 sharp instrument injuries. She had a large slash across her abdomen that exposed her intestines that was inflicted post-mortem, and there was evidence she'd been punched in the face. Westrom's semen was found on a towel in the bathroom, on a washcloth, and on the bedspread. He was 27. Jane Hilton was killed in 1985 by Michael Green in a stranger thrill kill. Jane was stabbed and bitten in a friend's El Dorado Hills, California home. She was found in a bloody, chaotic scene in the master bedroom, not the guest room she was staying in. There were 29 stab wounds on Jane's head, chest, back, and arms. She still had the broken tip of a knife in her skull. She had bruising on her cheeks, eye, nose, upper lip, and jaw, and a large chunk of flesh was missing from her chin. She was not raped, but the killer had bitten her on the shoulder and left his saliva. Michael Green was 17 years old. Rachel Johnson was killed in 1991 by Daniel Reese, a guy she knew from the neighborhood. Young mother Rachel was raped, stabbed, and set on fire in the middle of a street. Her torso, neck, and head were burned, but her throat had also been slashed. The body had been dragged to where she was found, and bruises were noted on both wrists that pointed to restraints. Fingertip-shaped bruises on her inner thighs also pointed to a sexual assault. Sperm and pubic hair was left behind by her assailant, Daniel Reese, who was 28. Nadine Major was killed in 1980 in Willoughby, Ohio by Stephen Joseph Simcak, who was identified posthumously. Nadine was found on her kitchen floor, a large butcher knife sticking out of her chest. Her young son was in his crib nearby. There is no known connection between Nadine, a happily married new mom, and Simcak. Nadine had 13 stab wounds in her back and 4 to her upper chest area. There were 2 stab wounds in her neck and 4 stab wounds in her left arm. All in all, 44 stab wounds. The butcher knife was found sticking straight up out of her chest. It belonged to Nadine and had been kept in a kitchen drawer that was found open. There is no known connection between Nadine and Stephen Simcak, who was 40 years old. Tanya McKinley was killed on New Year's Day, 1985, by Daniel Wells, whom she had met at a bar and had a one-night stand with. Tanya, a young mother, was found dead on the grass between the sidewalk and the street in a nice residential neighborhood in Pensacola, Florida. Wells said he met Tanya at a bar on New Year's Eve and took her home. Tanya died from strangulation, from a ligature wrapped around her throat. She had also been struck by a blunt object which had caused bleeding and dried blood in her hair. There was evidence she'd been raped, with scrapes on her legs indicating her pantyhose had been forcibly pulled down, and semen was found in the sexual assault kit. Daniel Wells was 23. Sophie Sergi was killed by Stephen Downs in a student dorm at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in 1993. Downs was a stranger to Sophie, as far as we know, but was a fellow student and dorm resident. College sophomore Sophie was found in the bathtub of a women's hallway bathroom. She was found with her clothing on her lower half pulled down, exposing her genitals, and semen coming from her vagina. Her shirt and bra were pushed up. Everything was wet, as if she'd been rinsed off. She had a single gunshot wound to the back of the head, which was the cause of death. She had a 1/2-inch deep stab wound in the right corner of her eye that was pre-mortem, and a gaping stab wound in her right cheek was post-mortem. She had also been beaten and possibly tasered. Stephen Downs was 19. Christy Marak was killed in 1992 by Raymond Rowe, an unknown connection/stalker situation. Christy was attacked, raped, and bludgeoned in her home right before Christmas in 1992 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. She was lying on her back. She'd been so badly beaten that her face was almost unrecognizable. She was killed in the very tight window after her roommate Mary left at 7 a.m. before 7:45 a.m. She was dressed for work and had her coat on. She had been raped and was found without her shoes, pants, or underwear on, although her socks, brown leather jacket, and burgundy gloves were still on, and her shirt, sweater, and jacket were pushed up on her torso. DNA was left behind by the perpetrator in the form of semen. Raymond Rowe was 24 years old. Helene Brzezinski was killed in 1980 by Curtis Allen White in a stranger-on-stranger crime. Helene was walking home from a bus stop in Englewood, Colorado, when she was abducted, raped, and stabbed to death in a rancher's field. Helene was found lying on her back, nude from the waist down. Her clothes were pushed up on her torso, exposing her breasts, and she had a strip of green fabric tied loosely around her neck. Her hands were bound behind her back. Her pants and shoes were missing, as was one of her earrings and her purse. She'd been stabbed 9 times. Vaginal and anal swabs exhibited the presence of sperm. Helene had trauma around the anal area, indicating that something had been inserted there. Her killer, Curtis Clanton, was 21. Lindy Sue Beekler was killed in 1975 by David Sinopoli, who was a neighbor and schoolmate. In December 1975, 19-year-old newlywed Lindy Sue Beekler was stabbed numerous times and sexually assaulted post-mortem in her ground-floor apartment in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. She was found by relatives lying face up on the living room floor. Her legs were bent underneath her at an unnatural angle. She had a tea towel-covered knife handle sticking out of the left side of her neck. Both the towel and knife came from within the apartment. Her jeans were unbuttoned and unzipped all the way, partially exposing the pantyhose she wore underneath. Lindy had 19 total stab wounds. A different, smaller knife had been used initially and had possibly broken. Her killer, David Sinopoli, was 21 years old. Linda Slayton was killed by Joseph Clinton Mills in 1981. They were acquainted. He was her son's football coach. Linda was a single mom of 2 boys who was found dead in her ground floor bedroom while her boys were asleep in other rooms. Her window was open. Linda lay face up across the middle of the bed. Her face was bruised, and a wire coat hanger was still twisted tightly around her neck. Her legs were spread. Her red polka dot strapless sundress had been yanked down, exposing her breasts, and also pulled up so her genital area was exposed. Blood leaked from her vagina, her mouth, and her nose. A 1/2-inch laceration inside the entrance to Linda's vaginal cavity was the result of a foreign object being roughly inserted. They believe she was penetrated with the hanger. Based on the quantity of intact sperm, meaning their tails were still attached, the deposit was determined to be recent and likely to have coincided with the approximate time of Linda's murder, around 4:30 in the morning. Joseph Clinton Mills was 20 years old. Nancy Doherty was killed in 1986 by teenager Michael Carbo. They had no known connection, but he was a neighborhood teen who went to school with her kids. Nancy was home alone when she was killed. She was found lying face up on her bed, buried under the bedclothes with a pillow over her face. She was nude and her hair was damp. The 38-year-old had been raped and strangled. She died of asphyxiation secondary to manual strangulation. Abrasions on her neck were plainly visible. She also had severe blunt force injuries to the head and face, and vegetation and dampness told the investigators that the attack on Nancy had started outside. Sperm was detected on the vaginal swabs and one from Nancy's buttocks. Her killer, Michael Carbo, was 18 years old. Patty Stichler was killed on New Year's Day, 1985 by teenager Michael Mellis. The relationship was unknown, but he was a neighbor. Patty Stichler was a 30-year-old divorced mom of 3 young girls when she was killed in her single-level Sylvania, Ohio home on New Year's Day. Her girls were home at the time of the murder. Patty was found on the floor of her bedroom between the foot of the bed and the dresser. She was face up and mostly naked, just a sweatshirt that she slept in. She had a gaping cut on her cheek and her throat had been cut severely on both sides. She'd been stabbed 19 times with a knife in the abdomen and chest, some of the stab wounds delivered through her sweatshirt. It appeared that the suspect kept stabbing her after she was dead. Patty had stayed alive long enough to fight. Her fingers and lower arms were badly cut, most likely from trying to defend herself. She was not raped. Michael Mellis was 17 years old. Hi guys, it's Jess. As you all know, I'm about to go on my summer break because here in the Northeast, we have to take nice weather when we can get it. And you know what I want no part of this summer as I spend my hard-earned money on vacations, eating out, and summer concerts? Getting burned by a massive wireless bill. We've all gotten so used to excessive bills and overages from the big 3 wireless companies, we sometimes need a reminder. It doesn't have to be this way. This summer, you should spend your money on things you want to, not things beyond your control. Take control and make the switch to Mint Mobile like I did. With Mint, you can get the coverage and speed you're used to, but for way less money. For a limited time, Mint Mobile is offering 3 months of unlimited premium wireless service for $15 a month. All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. You can keep your existing phone number, your contacts, and even your same phone. Switching over is easy with any Mint Mobile plan. I use Mint Mobile and you should too. Ditch overpriced wireless and get 3 months of unlimited service from Mint Mobile for $15 a month. I'm saving money and my wireless service has been top-notch. It's a win-win. This year, take control of your wireless bill and your pocketbook. Get this new customer offer and your 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/DNAID. That's mintmobile.com/DNAID. Upfront payment of $45 required, equivalent to $15 a month. Limited time new customer offer for first 3 months only. Speeds may slow above 35 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details.
From coast to coast, unlock adventure at Red Lion Hotels by Sonesta, where restful sleep, friendly service, and local knowledge await. Whether for business or pleasure, spend less and make more of every trip. When you sign up for the Sonesta Travel Pass, you'll get their best rates instantly. Go to Sonesta.com to book your stay and unlock their best rates with Sonesta Travel Pass. Here today, roam tomorrow. Join now at Sonesta.com. Terms and conditions apply.
Here is my conversation with Julia Cowley. I found it very enlightening. I hope you agree. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me. I'm so excited.
You're welcome. Me too. It's a good topic.
Where should we start? What are your thoughts?
I don't know. I mean, I guess I could start with the fact that when I was in the FBI's behavioral analysis unit, I think most people think of that unit as only working on serial murder type cases where you see an offender who attacks many victims. There's a cooling off period. 3 or more typically is what we would classify a serial offender. And we did some of those cases. Obviously, the BAU does get involved in many of those cases, but the majority of our cases are very similar to the ones you shared with me, the ones where you have a crime that seems so brutal, and there might even be a sexual assault or sexual component to it, and it's the type of crime you would think this has to be the result of a serial offender. But then it turns out in the long run that it's not. And serial offending is very rare. Serial killers and serial murders is very rare occurrence. Most of the cases out there are cases like the ones you shared with me to talk about today. But you also have the ones where you have all the victims that actually know their offenders very well. And we worked on a lot of those as well. But the majority of the cases I worked on were cases like this, or where the victim knew the offender. Most people who commit murder only commit one murder.
Right.
And some of them seem inexplicably. Why? Just one, especially some of the ones you've shared.
Yeah. I mean, and some of these, it seems as though it seems to me there's some distinctions here. One of the notes I made to talk to you about was like fixation versus fantasy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in some of these cases, it's clear that the victim was a specific fixation of the killer, right? And he engineered a confrontation. And that's what we don't know is what he was hoping would happen from that confrontation, right? I'm thinking of the Patty Stichler case where she was lying in bed and had 3 little girls at home, and the 17-year-old Michael Mellis walked into her bedroom with a knife, right? And I'm thinking of, I think that Gary Shara was fixated on his victim in the Lisa Ziegert. And I know you worked that case. I mean, I think those victims were very specific. And then you have some others where they were like a one-time random target, it seems. And those guys, to me, seem like they're more likely to reoffend, is the ones that it was random and they liked it, right?
Right.
I mean, the fixated ones seems like some of them maybe something went wrong. And Lindy Sue Beekler, another example, the girl who was like 19, just married, and it turned out David Sinopoli stabbed her, but it clearly got very out of hand. He broke his knife, right, and left a knife sticking in her throat, and that whole thing, I think, got spiraled very quickly out of control. So, so anyway, fixation versus fantasy, I thought was an interesting topic.
Yeah, and even those fixation cases and the fantasy-based cases, a lot of those fixation cases have a fantasy built in. And of these cases, I should point out, I did do a profile of Lisa Ziegert's murderer. So I have worked on that case. And then the other case I'm very familiar with is Darling Krashock, because I didn't actually do a profile, but I have seen all the case materials and I've studied them. So I am very familiar with that one. The rest of them, some of them I've heard about in the media, and other ones I hadn't heard of until I heard from your show. So in looking at them and looking at the ones that I know really well, what you're trying to determine, you really have to look closely at every single injury. And what are we looking at? Are we looking at someone who's gaining gratification because they're inflicting that injury? Or are we looking at someone who couldn't control the victim and the injuries to the victim are defense wounds or mistakes or, unintentional? So you start, you're trying to figure out, okay, was that meant to be or was that accidental because of the situation and how the victim reacted and the offender's level of sophistication? But in looking at these fantasy-based crimes, a lot of even the fixation ones are fantasy-based. And Gary Shara, while I think he was fixated on Lisa, he had seen her before and he targeted her specifically. But there's no indication they knew each other personally in life. Like he may have been into the store. I believe he'd been into the store before, but somehow he came into contact with her. Yeah. But he also had a fantasy. He had a fantasy he talked about in his confession, having fantasies of abduction. And so there was a fantasy part of it. Sometimes with these offenders who have fantasies, they, just like anything else, sometimes those fantasies don't live up to how they envisioned it, and things do go wrong. Or, there's so many variables and each case is different. So I think looking at everything very closely, very specifically to try to figure out, okay, did something go wrong here? Did it not go well? Were they acting out just because that was a time period in their life where they had a stressor? And once they committed that crime, that stress was released, or they committed the crime and that created a new series of stressors. They don't want to get caught. Sometimes they feel guilt. I don't see that a lot, but occasionally they might have some guilt associated. It's usually inward, and some, they feel bad for themselves mostly. But there are all these different factors, and just like all of our personality traits and characteristics, offender personality traits and characteristics are all very unique. Some of them have some similarities. You see cases with a lot of similarities, but you're looking at each individual case very closely to try to figure out. And it can be hard to predict. When you see something and you see how, let's say, how brutal, how deviant a crime is, we want to jump to the conclusion they're going to do this again. And that's a safe bet. I mean, that's when you profile something, you say they probably have a history of violence and they're probably going to be violent in the future. But that's, as we see, that's not always the case. So
interestingly, the fixation versus fantasy thing, I think is illustrated very well by the two cases in the packet that I sent you, which I think has 12 cases. Maybe I can't remember how many I sent you, but two cases that used coat hangers. Okay.
Yes.
So one was Linda Slayton, who she was a young mother. The football coach of her young sons, I think he was only 20. The football coach climbed in her bedroom window in the middle of the night and sexually assaulted her and strangled her with a coat hanger. Okay. So that's one of the scenarios where he clearly fixated on her. She was the target of his what we don't know. Fantasy. I mean, what did he think was going to happen when he climbed in the window? Was she going to be like, oh, okay, let's go for it? You know what I mean? What
Hmm.
we don't know what these guys hoped is going to happen. Versus Darlene Krashock, right, where she was found. We don't know of any real connection between her and Michael White. It seems like they might have met randomly at a bar, although they both were maybe on the same military base at the same time. And he bridled her in the most horrific manner with this coat hanger contraption, which one wonders whether that was pre-made, right? I don't know because I didn't get the crime scene photos for that. I'm sure you did. So maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I don't see any indication it was pre-made.
Okay.
I think it was something he grabbed. He had an opportunity. From the investigation, it does appear they may have met in the bar, and maybe he was going to give her a ride home. Seems that she had gone willingly with him, and then he took her to a location where he sexually assaulted and murdered her. And I do think that was probably more an opportunistic encounter for him. And that's what you see a lot of these in the younger offenders, when you see that these are very opportunistic, impulsive types of crimes, that they may just realize, okay, I was impulsive, and I'm not going to do that again, because they
Right.
don't want to get caught.
Right.
And I think that also goes with what was the other case, the one who went through the bedroom?
Linda Slayton was the
Linda
football
Slayton.
coach. Yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, the coat hanger, another opportunistic weapon. So he went in there really without a plan. Probably, he probably had some kind of idea. We never really know what these people are thinking. They don't ever really share a lot of information. They hold back a lot. Even if they do confess, they hold back, and they often don't have a lot of insight into their own behavior. But another opportunistic, and I just think that's a coincidence. They both had these items available, and they're bendable, and they had obviously some kind of fantasy that involved strangulation.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And speaking of fantasy, then we have at least one case I sent you, or two actually, that I can think of right off the bat that didn't have any sexual assault. And the victims were completely clothed. And we really don't, I mean, we don't know what. So one of them is the case of Michelle Martinko, where Jerry Lynn Burns basically assaulted her in the parking lot of the mall and stabbed her to death in her car in an incredibly bloodied, frenzied stabbing attack, right? So he was dressed, she was dressed, he was wearing gloves, he brought a knife, he planned to kill someone that night is what we think, and he never did it again. But when he was arrested, he was found with a ton of pornographic material, including like snuff films with young blondes, right? So that goes to that. And then the other one is this Nadine Major case, which really not that many people had heard of. And it was a young mother whose son was in the crib nearby, and she was found on the kitchen floor with a knife sticking out of her chest, butcher knife that came from the house. We have no idea what happened in that scenario, what motivated the killer, because by the time they got to him, he was dead. So two interesting ones. No sexual assault in either case. Would you guys consider those like a sexual fantasy based on stabbing, or maybe they didn't get a chance to get to the sexual assault because things went wrong?
So I would look at those as it was likely intended, because you're looking at the victims and the victim selection, and likely intended to be some kind of sexual encounter. Now, just because you don't have an actual sexual assault legally, it doesn't mean there isn't some fantasy involved, some sexual component to it. Again, looking at the victim selection, I would be surprised if there was not some kind of sexual gratification or arousal that came, as part of the motivation for committing those crimes. Especially looking at the victimology, you can't find anything else that would go to motive. They kind of fall back on, okay, is there some, fantasy going on? And the fantasy could involve, I mean, it's always an interesting selection of weapon. we're always looking at what kind of weapon is used. And when somebody uses a knife, we tend to think they're comfortable with a knife. They may have a fantasy of using a knife, but they're comfortable with it and likely carry them around with them, have used them before. But it's an interesting choice. The easiest way to kill someone is to just use a gun, but someone
Right.
who wants to use a knife and plans it, not just grabs one off the kitchen counter because a fight ensued, or they didn't necessarily go in with the intention of murdering. Maybe they just went into with the intention of a sexual assault, and whatever happened after that happens, right?
Right.
And so you just have to each situation again is different. Now, going back, because I know Lisa Ziegert's case so well, I was pretty comfortable with saying this is somebody who, wanted to abduct, use a knife on her, comfortable using a knife, probably carried one around with him. And there was another case I wanted to contrast that to, and now I can't remember which one it was. But you're always just looking for, is it a weapon of opportunity or is it a weapon that they brought with them?
Right, that's a good point. Yeah, because I mean, there were at least two of the cases in here. The guy started with like a small weapon that he brought along, and they think it got broken or it wasn't doing the trick,
That's right.
right? And then they go to a butcher knife that was in the home. That was the major case and the Lindy Sue Beekler case. Both of them, they end up the perpetrator ended up using a knife that he grabbed. It's interesting how many of these cases involve stabbings. And many of them, the guy did bring his own weapon, which, and for example, Jerry Westrom, the guy who's known as the hockey dad, right? You saw that one where he
Yes.
killed sex worker Jean Childs, and she was stabbed 65 times. And they had a sexual encounter, it looks like, based on how much semen was found all over the place. Uh, you know, she was naked, obviously. So one wonders why he would bring a knife to that. I mean,
Yeah.
that's, but
Unless he always had one with him, carried one
yeah,
with him. But, he likely, maybe, I guess you don't know for sure. But and the one thing I want to do is distinguish between a couple of things, because this was something I saw in Lisa Ziegert's case. And you had showed me there had been a much earlier profile done of Lisa Ziegert's murderer. And
yeah,
that was done back in 1992. And so when I looked at the case, this was many, many years later, and I had a different view. So there's a difference between a sexually motivated homicide and what we call a rape murder.
okay,
And a sexually motivated homicide, and I'm just going to simplify it because, again, these offenders can have very complex
sure,
motivations and fantasies, but sexually motivated homicide, the end goal is to kill. And that's the ultimate gratification. And that's when you see your serial offenders typically. Now, rape, murder, the intention is to sexually assault. And what happens after that isn't really a concern. And murder may be because the victim fought back and things did get out of control. It could be witness elimination. Murder's intentional because I've just, they've seen my face. I'm just going to kill them. I don't care. A lot of times victims are left. They're left alive, but the offender doesn't care whether they live or die, and they end up dying. So there's a distinguish that. And, when the earlier profile was done with Lisa Ziegert's offender, they called it a sexual homicide. And when I looked at her injuries weren't what I felt were gratuitous in nature.
okay,
They were mostly defensive. I think they were accidental. I think she put up a very, very vigorous fight. And a lot of those injuries, while it looked extremely gruesome, a lot of them were superficial. And it was because she was fighting and he lost control. So I didn't see anything that said, okay, the ultimate goal was necessarily to kill her. He ended up killing her, obviously. And I think that was intentional, but I think it was more for witness elimination. But I didn't see what I would consider gratuitous violence, where the violence was what he was striving for. He was striving for the abduction, the sexual assault, and then whatever happened after that happened. And
Okay.
that was a big difference. And I think a lot of time when you look at some of these cases, you're looking at, okay, does this appear to be what we would call a sexually motivated homicide, where the ultimate goal was to kill, or was just the ultimate goal was to sexually assault the victim, and things went wrong, or the offender decided
Right.
just to kill him. So there, you have to distinguish that. And I think when you see when you see a sexually motivated crime, you think this could very likely turn into a serial offender, or
Right.
already a serial offender. When you see what you think is more of a rape murder, where the sexual assault has taken place and then the murder happens, those tend to be the ones I think you might not see that person necessarily murder again. And I don't, I never use absolutes in this
Right.
business. It's nothing's ever absolute, but that's what I'm looking for when I'm looking at these cases, to make a determination. Okay, are we looking at somebody who's just would offend one time, or are we looking at someone who's going to offend multiple times? And of course, by the time I get a lot of these cases, it's been years and years and years. And when I looked at Lisa's case, there had been nothing else linked, and they
Right.
had his DNA. So I knew, well, there was nothing else that had happened that we know of. So you start to kind of look at the case in a different light.
Yeah. Okay. That's fascinating.
Does that
Uh,
make sense?
It totally makes sense. I mean, as you said, I think it's really hard because, as you pointed out, each one of these cases has such specific nuances, right? I mean,
Yes.
that makes it's really everyone is unique, and that really can go to motive and what actually happened and what drove the guy over the edge.
With a detailed agent directory you won't find anywhere else, Homes.com is the only place to find the in-depth info home shoppers want. Very in-depth info. Looking for a listing agent's contact info? We've got it. The agent with the most sales in your price range? Easy. Specialized agents with all the up-to-date info on your dream neighborhood? We'll know them. A Pisces who enjoys long walks on the beach? You've got other sites for that.
Homes.com. We've done your homework.
Hi, I'm Cindy Crawford, and I'm the founder of Meaningful Beauty. When Dr. Sabah and I decided to do a skincare line together, he said to me, "We are going to give women meaningful beauty." And I said, "That's exactly right. We want to give women meaningful beauty," which means each and every product is meaningful. It has a reason to exist. It's efficacious. You're going to get results. And then you just go out and live your life.
Meaningful Beauty. Confidence is beautiful. Learn more at meaningfulbeauty.com.
From coast to coast, unlock adventure at Red Lion Hotels by Sonesta, where restful sleep, friendly service, and local knowledge await. Whether for business or pleasure, spend less and make more of every trip. When you sign up for the Sonesta Travel Pass, you'll get their best rates instantly. Go to Sonesta.com to book your stay and unlock their best rates with Sonesta Travel Pass. Here today, roam tomorrow. Join now at Sonesta.com. Terms and conditions apply.
Let's talk about one case that's really interesting. There's a pattern here in the cases I sent you of a lot of very young offenders.
Yes.
So the oldest and this guy's been an outlier from the beginning. This Simcac, Michael Simcac, who killed Nadine Major, was 40. He is the one who lived to be 80 and had grandchildren and lived a ripe old age and died. And we don't really have any idea how they even knew each other, if they did, what his motivation was. So he's sort of an outlier. Many of these guys were teenagers. I mean, Michael Mellis was 17 when he broke into Patty Stichler's home through the bathroom window and walked into her bedroom with a butterfly knife. Michael Green. Okay, now this guy is a real outlier as well because police believe it was a thrill kill. He went to the home where Jane Hilton was staying, and basically she came out of her bedroom and said, "Who are you?" And he attacked her, killed her in a very violent, multiple stabbings, and they eventually got him because he had bitten her and left his saliva on her nightgown. There was no sexual assault there. There was no apparent reason for him to have gone after her in such a violent manner. So again, a very unique case there. And the last one I wanted to bring up is Michael Carbo, who killed Nancy Doherty. He was only 18. He was going to school with her kids, and he was a peeper. He was basically a peeping Tom. And they believe he had been watching her daughter, maybe, getting out of the shower. He had watched a neighbor girl getting out of the shower regularly until the dad beat him up. But they think she confronted him outside, and he didn't have a weapon. He was confronted out in the yard at night, 3 a.m, and she ended up strangled and raped in her bed. Like I think he basically knocked her down in the yard and carried her, dragged her into the bedroom and raped her and strangled her. That to me seems very unplanned, right? That went wrong. But so in that case, like, does the guy just lose control and snap and kill her in a rage? Or is that as rational as victim elimination, do you think?
I think it's somewhere in between. I don't buy into the fact that people snap. I
Okay.
feel there's an escalation. You find yourself in a situation and you are doing what you can to survive that situation or make the most of the situation. But I just don't really buy the snapping part of it. I mean, he was opportunistic. It was impulsive. And that's what you see with these younger offenders that offend, and then you find them 20 years later and they haven't offended again.
Right.
Some of it, and no one knows why. It's so difficult if we could just harness all our knowledge and predict who is going to offend in the first place and who will never offend again. That small percentage of people. I wish we could do that to predict this. But the younger offenders that do that, a lot of times I think we think, oh my gosh, they've killed at 17 years old. They're going to kill again for sure.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the assumption I would make out of an abundance of caution. But as we know, that's not always the case. And I think because just like anything else, young kids do things they regret, stupid things, they make poor decisions, not on the level of murder, but I'm just saying that that's what happens as we get older. We start becoming less impulsive, less opportunistic. We age out of some of our younger behavior. I think it's the same thing, but just at a more extreme level. And so something that they did as a 17-year-old, they wouldn't necessarily do as they got older. And they realized, oh, what have I done? And they learn from their mistakes. Now, saying that, though, I don't believe that somebody who has committed some of these crimes are just going on to be totally normal people. There's always, I don't care what people want to say about what a great dad he was, what a wonderful coworker he was, how loving he was to his dying wife who had cancer. I don't care what people say. There are going to be leaks, and we all know that you never know what goes on behind closed doors. And I think it was Michael Carbo. And so you might have to correct me if I'm wrong, because a lot of these cases are.
I know, I sent you a lot.
Yeah, you sent me a lot, but I tried. But, was he the one who had letters, all these letters of support,
Yes,
and just talked about, like, he was talked about as being, I forget some of the terms used, but all, glowing terms. I think one was like, he was so joyous. He was gentle. He was, I mean, so these are all people that know him. But then in some of the documentation that you sent me, he was on the phone. It was a jail call recorded. And did I write it down?
Yeah, then he has used this very coarse language and
yeah. So he's on the phone with a female friend, and she tells him that they have found his semen at the scene, and his response is, "Yeah, so what? So she got effed."
Yeah.
Before she died. How callous and this is not a gentle person. This is not a kind person. This is a uncaring, unempathetic, mean, vindictive person. I mean, that sentence right there, it just is that conversation. Those are his true colors. And so you have all these letters of support. Do people really know him? Either they're fooling themselves, or he put on a great mask. A lot of people are able to do that, and people that don't know them very well don't see this side of him. But there's always going to be what I consider this leakage. And, either family members don't realize it because they're abused. Potentially,
Right.
they don't realize that they're abused. They don't realize they may be lying. They may have never seen it because he's worn this mask, or there's just a number of reasons why.
Yeah.
But
Well, no, that's segues right into a very interesting case, the Sophie Sergi murder. So Stephen Downs was the killer, and they lived in the same dormitory at University of Alaska. She was like, this is the one where she was found in the bathtub in the common women's bathroom at the end of the hallway. And there is no known connection between the two other than they lived in the same dorm, different floors, right? Because he lived on a guy's floor and she lived on a girl's floor. The violence done to her was pretty horrific, shot and stabbed and I think bitten. I mean, really bad. And he went on to be a nurse. He's a nurse. And, no one had a bad thing to say about him until the police started really digging. And there were some reports that some patients had complained that he was mean to them or he hurt them, So, again, that was the kind of thing that all the publicity was like, oh, this male nurse was arrested. He was so kind. But that actually wasn't true. It was a guise that he essentially adopted in public.
yeah, exactly. And the interesting thing, nursing, that is a very honorable profession. And we think of nurses as kind and caring. Most of them are. They go into that field to help people. But you're going to have a select few that go into a field like that because they are witnessing suffering.
Right.
And that may be something that they enjoy. It's like,
Wow.
yeah, you have to consider that just because they're in a noble profession doesn't mean they chose that profession for noble reasons. Someone like that chose probably for selfish reasons. And there's also some gratification in accolades for taking care of people that probably fed his, I don't want to diagnose him as a narcissist because I am not capable of diagnoses, but, that fed that ego that he probably needed to have fed. And so being in that position gets you recognition, but it also puts you in a position to watch others suffer, which is probably something he enjoyed, particularly if patients are saying he's harming me.
Mm-hmm.
And, and then, looking back with something you had said about the level of brutality with a crime like that, and in snapping, it seems like, oh, this person just snapped because these things are what I believe to be building in someone for a very long time.
Yeah.
And they've had thoughts of hurting other people. They've had, and they're not completely composed thoughts or planned out, like this is exactly how I'm going to do it. Some crimes you see, I think Gary Shara had a plan.
Right.
But then other people find they've been having these thoughts and feeling these violent fantasies, and then they find themselves with an opportunity or a situation, and perhaps it's a situation they didn't even expect was going to happen. Maybe there was a conversation. Maybe a victim said something that made this offender want to attack that victim in that moment. And it seems like, boy, he just snapped. He didn't really snap. This was building up for a long period of time. That's what I believe. I don't believe people just snap and just kill somebody and shoot them and bite them and throw them in a bathtub. I just don't buy that. I think it
doesn't come out of nowhere, you're saying. Yeah.
It doesn't come out of nowhere. They just haven't told anybody, or they've never acted on those fantasies before. Right. Now, you also have to consider potential mental health issues in any of these cases. And when you look at things that seem very irrational, is there a mental health component? And I'm not saying that there is in any of these cases because I don't know, but that's another thing you're considering. Is this, were there any steps that seemed rational? And are they exhibiting things that would indicate they knew right from wrong?
Right.
such as hiding a body or trying to destroy evidence and things like that.
Yeah. Okay. Fascinating. I mean, that case in particular, yeah, she was punched, she was stabbed, while she was alive and after she was dead, she was shot in the head, and there are some marks on her that may have been a taser. But in any event, and then she was raped and left with her pants down. So
Yeah.
in that case, so what you have is a college student wandering around the girls' floor of the dorm, armed with a knife and a gun. Like, to me, that's pretty apparent that he was clearly just looking for a victim and he was gonna do something about that. It's crazy that it's crazy to me because I'm a rational, non-murderous person that you can just wander around and not care who your victim is. It's just going to be someone, right?
Right.
You to
Yeah.
the Michelle Marchenko case, I don't think that Jerry Burns specifically was stalking her. I think she was just a pretty blonde and he followed her out of the mall. I mean,
Hmm.
that's what's so frightening in so many of these cases, right? Is that it's pure fate.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too, the offender having multiple weapons and multiple causes of death. So one thing I want to clarify, two thoughts on that. First of all, he's not very confident. Likely hasn't you have to have two different weapons and
Mm.
perhaps he had one that was part of the fantasy, another one that's for insurance. Like
Okay.
I'm going to finish the job. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I'm just saying these are things to consider.
Yeah.
And he knows he's going to kill, but he wants to use a knife for control or things like that. But it kind of goes to his confidence. And then also, when you have multiple causes of death or extremely brutal crimes, it doesn't necessarily speak to the offender's sophistication. Just because it's really brutal, it can also speak to experimentation and unsophistication, or they've just never done anything like this before. So they're trying to figure out, okay, what's the best way to do that? So sometimes you'll see these cases like this is a Darling crash shock is another really good example.
Yeah.
Just horrific. And you think, oh, well, this person had to have done it before. But when you see the injury and level of injuries and there's some experimentation there, you think maybe they haven't done this before. And I think that was where my profile agreed with the original profile of Lisa Ziegert as well, that there was some inexperience there. Despite the brutality, it seemed like the person was likely more inexperienced than not. So brutality doesn't always necessarily mean, or deviance. Deviance and brutality do not always necessarily mean experienced,
Hmm. Okay.
criminally experienced.
Right. Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, and speaking of criminally experienced, one thing I did note, and I'm just looking at my list that I made here, is that a bunch of these guys, even though we don't think they ever murdered anyone else, they did have other they had other, what do you guys call it when they sort of like they escalate to murder, but they have other sort of sexually motivated lower level crimes, that we've known they've done. Peeping
Yeah.
is the most common one,
Yeah,
right?
I
So,
would just call that either their criminal history, and if it's not in their criminal history, I would call it a personal history. But those those are all what we would call paraphilias,
yeah, right.
and yeah, they manifest in different ways, and especially when you see someone entering a home where someone is expected to be home, that's where I always think you have a problem here. This person is going into someone's home, and they likely, when you see that, like if you have someone who enters a home invasion, murder, or home invasion, sexual assault, you're not
Mhm.
necessarily looking for the offender who has a history of sexual assault. You're not just looking for sex crimes. You're also looking for crimes of voyeurism, trespass, burglary, even
Okay, interesting.
burglary during the day.
Yeah.
Those are these types of crimes that are what say cross boundaries. And so many of these offenders will have that kind of a background.
Yeah, I mean, so we know Gary Shara had a extensive sexual dysfunction, right? I mean, remember he had to wear like a bat suit or what? Yeah. Ge
Right.
Jerry Burns had just reams and reams of pornography and snuff films when they arrested him. Simcak, this guy that we don't know anything about, he did try to kiss his teenage son's girlfriend, who, when in a moment of, I don't know if it was weakness or what, but that's not normal, obviously.
Right.
Jerry Westrom was arrested. He's the one who killed Gene Childs. He was arrested in numerous prostitution stings, frequenting other sex workers even after the murder, which is really, scary. Daniel Wells, who killed Tanya McKinley, which we haven't talked about, seems like that was a chance meeting at a bar, and she wanted to go home, and he wanted to have sex with her, and so he killed her and raped her, and after she was dead. He had a history after that of exposure, many, many instances of exhibitionism, essentially. Clanton, the guy whose real name was White, who raped and killed Helene Prusinski, had raped other women. And then finally, Peeping. We have Michael Carbo, David Sinopoli, they think was watching Lindy Sue Beekler, Christy Marak's murderer, the DJ, Freeze Rowe, what they believe was watching her through the windows, and Michael Mellis, Patty Stichler's murder, they believe was watching her through her windows. So, that's a lot of messed up behavior.
Yeah. And I well, I don't want to say always, but I am pretty convinced that when you see these types of crimes, even if you only see that they've ever done one, there's always going to be something in their history. People may not know about it. People may not report it, but there is something. You don't just go to murder. You don't just go to sexual assault murder. You have issues in your life that, again, maybe they go unreported by anybody. Maybe nobody ever knows about them. But I've found there's always something. Whenever I've heard like a case I worked on and somebody calls, like a detective will call and like, there's no criminal history. I'm like, there's something there, something, and you may never find it, but usually I've found that there's something there that should have been a red flag. Now, it could be a red flag and people aren't going to jump to the conclusion that this person is capable of murder. But once you have this murder, you go back and you look, and everybody with common sense would go, yeah, that was a red flag. And, you brought up the offender who was an exhibitionist. One thing I want to say about exhibitionists is sometimes those are considered just nuisance crimes. They're not that serious. But when you put yourself into why that person is doing that, and what I always say, they are inflicting their will upon somebody who is not consenting. And so it's not for good reasons. It's there to frighten them and scare them. It's degrading, humiliating in some ways, and it's embarrassing. But exhibitionism, some people may engage in that paraphilia and never escalate. But in my opinion, I don't think exhibitionism should ever be considered just a nuisance crime or not serious, or that's just I forget what I had a colleague call it once, and I said, I don't see it that way. I don't see it as something that's not serious. I find that to be potentially could be just one part of a paraphilia that could develop into something else. But you just brought that up, but I just wanted to make that point to your listeners, because I think that kind of stuff just gets brushed off. And I think people, and we're much more knowledgeable today about sex crimes, but long time ago when a lot of these cases took place, detectives might overlook somebody like that.
Yeah.
Oh, they're just a flasher. No.
Well, yeah, and that's interesting that's interesting that you equate it to exerting like a level of control, right? Like it's sort of it puts the victim in a very sort of demeaned position.
With a detailed agent directory you won't find anywhere else, Homes.com is the only place to find the in-depth info home shoppers want. Very in-depth info. Looking for a listing agent's contact info? We've got it. The agent with the most sales in your price range? Easy. Specialized agents with all the up-to-date info on your dream neighborhood? We'll know them. A Pisces who enjoys long walks on the beach? You've got other sites for that.
Homes.com. We've done your homework.
Hi, I'm Cindy Crawford, and I'm the founder of Meaningful Beauty. When Dr. Sabah and I decided to do a skincare line together, he said to me, we are going to give women meaningful beauty. And I said, that's exactly right. We want to give women meaningful beauty, which means each and every product is meaningful. It has a reason to exist. It's efficacious. You're going to get results. And then you just go out and live your life.
Meaningful Beauty. Confidence is beautiful. Learn more at meaningfulbeauty.com.
From coast to coast, unlock adventure at Red Lion Hotels by Sonesta, where restful sleep, friendly service, and local knowledge await. Whether for business or pleasure, spend less and make more of every trip. When you sign up for the Sonesta Travel Pass, you'll get their best rates instantly. Go to Sonesta.com to book your stay and unlock their best rates with Sonesta Travel Pass. Here today, roam tomorrow. Join now at Sonesta.com. Terms and conditions apply.
And I'll tell you a story that I've never told on this show before, and I actually don't talk about it very often, but it happened to me. I was 11 years old, and my sister and I were playing outside. My parents' house is in Washington, D.C., and we live sort of on a main road, but we have an alley behind our house that was very frequented by cars. But a car came down the wrong way. Down the alley, it was one way. And it was a beat-up white Volvo, and there was a young guy in the driver's seat who called me over to the car and said, hey, can you point me to the park? And I said, oh, the park is that way. And I pointed to the park. And he said, well, I can't find it on this map. So, I was 11. I went over to the car to look at I felt rude saying, well, it didn't even occur to me not to go look at the map, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I went and there was no map. He had no pants on, erect penis, quite small, as I seem to remember even then, that it wasn't big. And he said nothing. And I remember just backing away in horror, and he drove off. That was it. That was the extent of the interaction.
Right.
Um,
And so when you look at that crime that happened to you, what was his goal? His goal was to see your reaction, to frighten you. That's sadistic.
right.
That is sadistic. And I just never like to minimize those crimes that I think in the past have been minimized. I find them very problematic. But the goal, you are dealing with somebody who enjoys inflicting fear. And when, take this and look at a serial murderer who enjoys strangling someone and watching the fear in their eyes and life goes out of their eyes, there's not any difference.
Right. Wow.
It's just the level of crime.
Yeah.
It's just the injury, I guess, ultimate injury is more severe, obviously, in a murder. But the underlying, motives are very similar, and underlying some of those personality traits are very similar. I have a real problem with exposures, as you can see. I've just found I found through my career, those have been so minimized, and victims of that have been, just like, it's no big deal. They're just running up. No, it could very well escalate, and I've seen it escalate. And you had a case where you presented to me that it escalated. The person, that had a history of murdering somebody.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, I go off on tangents on that. I've talked about exposures on our show as well. And I just feel very strongly that is something that has to be taken seriously.
Well, that's fascinating. I'd never thought about it that way. Of course, my parents did call the police, and I remember being super ashamed to talk to them. I didn't want to talk to my sister. What made me basically go talk to them, my parents. My sister was the one who told my parents. I didn't even tell them.
It's degrading. That was the purpose, is to try to degrade and exert his control over someone else who's not consenting to that control. You don't want to see that. You didn't ask to see that. You weren't a willing participant. You were a child of all, even worse. And so, it is absolutely, that kind of person probably had other issues in their life of controlling people and trying to humiliate and degrade them. And that's what's so unfortunate too about people who are victims of sex crimes. It's, victims, they have a wide range of reaction, but a lot of times they feel embarrassed, ashamed, degraded. It's so difficult.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, last question. You touched on something earlier that I thought was interesting in that you mentioned whether any of these guys actually feel remorse, right? And whether because we know the reason we're talking about them is they didn't go on and kill again, right? For whatever, and some of them that's just circumstantial, but they didn't. In many cases they made a choice not to kill again, is what we think, right? So it does appear to me that there are a couple of the guys that we talked about who genuinely seem to express remorse. Um, this guy Curtis Clanton, who murdered Helene Brzezinski, he confessed as soon as the police found him, and talked about raising his own daughter, trying to treat her differently, and I believe that even the prosecutors felt that he was genuinely remorseful for what he had done. Then you have Gary Shara, right, who in the Lisa Ziegert case, who wrote those letters to his girlfriend, right, and when he knew the police were onto him, saying, how sorry he was for what he'd done. And again, none of these guys are coming forward and confessing. And it's not until they're caught that they show this remorse. But I'm wondering whether, I mean, it does seem to me that some of them, I have a little bit of, I feel a little bit sorry for them. They do seem like they regretted what happened. Do you have any feeling that about any of that either way?
I do. I think, and I mean, I come from a very law enforcement mind. Being in law enforcement and seeing what I've seen, I can be pretty harsh. So I'll try not to be harsh. But I think to be serious about this, I think it depends on the motivation for the crime.
Mhm.
But the crimes that you sent to me that I've reviewed, the remorse, they still they still come from a place where they had absolutely no regard for the victim, none whatsoever. Their own needs came first. Their own self-preservation came first. Everything about these crimes, these offenders are putting themselves first no matter what. And it's demonstrated behavior. I don't need to know them. We saw what they did to the victims. So when we talk about guilt and remorse, I don't think that they have it in the same way that normal people who don't do these types of things have guilt and remorse. Now, I think a lot of it goes to, well, I was young and impulsive and I did something stupid, and they may have some regrets and guilt and being fearful of being apprehended. And I think maybe that could get confused with having real remorse.
Okay.
And maybe they just feel guilt because basically the rest of their life they're looking over their shoulders. Now, is
Yeah.
it possible once they go on to have children, they recognize their, if they have a daughter, they recognize, well, gosh, I killed a girl her age or something like that. Is there any kind of self-reflection? Maybe with some people, but true remorse like a normal person would have, and I use normal with quotes, I don't believe so. Their actions have already demonstrated to me that they had absolutely no regard for another human life. They weren't, none of these people, none of the cases that I reviewed, even though some of them claimed self-defense, indicate to me that these were real situations of self-defense and they had no other choice. They had a choice in these. And they chose to disregard another human life in extremely brutal ways. So it's hard for me to really understand that. Now, I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist, and I never feel sympathy for people that commit these kinds of crimes.
Yeah.
So I
Okay. Well,
know that that probably doesn't give you a good answer.
no, it does.
Um,
It also brings up one of the last case that we have not touched on at all was Rachel Johnson, who was basically, it appears she needed a ride home late at night and knocked on the door of a guy that she knew growing up from the neighborhood, and his name is Daniel Reese. And the violence done to her was horrific. He left her set on fire in the middle of the street, okay, right after he raped her and killed her. Her throat was slashed. It's terrible. I mean, the violence done to her was horrific. Then he went on to ingratiate himself with her family. And you might have remember this write-up that I did. He basically became friends with her young daughter. He came over to their house for barbecues. He went to weddings. He was basically considered like part of the family. And when the family found out that he had been the one who killed Rachel, that is almost like another victimization, right? I mean, do you think
Totally.
he enjoyed that
Yes.
situation? Yeah.
Yeah. It's not the first time that I've seen cases. I'm not to that extent, but where an offender who has done something and they want to continue to relive that or continue to see the inflict pain. And so they reach out to victims' family members. It may be through a letter or a phone call. We saw that with the Island serial killer. It's a way to prolong torturing people. And then to ingratiate himself and become such a fixture, he's able to pretty much see the pain that he caused. And that's probably very gratifying to him. Yeah,
Wow.
I don't think that's based on any kind of trying to make amends. I don't believe that is based in anything other than enjoying watching them suffer and knowing that he's the cause of that. It's kind of like duper's delight, where you enjoy fooling people and I have a secret and nobody knows. And that can be very, very satisfying for certain people.
Wow. That's okay. That's pretty twisted.
Yeah.
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 Okay. All right. Well, I've kept you for an hour here, so I will let you go. But that is all so interesting, and I find your insights just really, really helpful in understanding, these guys who seem to. I think the key thing I took away from that last bit there was they really are, and again, not a psychologist or anything, but they're very, very self-involved, and
Yes.
self-preservation is the number one. And it is interesting. There is a trend of several of them who kill themselves after they are caught, whether in their jail cells, or I had one guy who took a header off a prison walkway 30 feet down, they just take themselves out. And we know Israel Keys obviously famously did the same. It's interesting but none of them really confessed before doing that. It still was, it was just their way of like just taking the quickest exit, I think, right?
Yeah. And you bring up Israel Keys and that's a great example. I did work on Israel Keys' case.
Yep.
Or the homicides that he committed. I worked on those as a profiler. And during one of his interviews, he said, those are my secrets. And he did leave this earth, leaving a bunch of unanswered questions. I think he did that on purpose. And some of the offenders that you've profiled or you've had on the cases that you've had on your show, that's exactly what they're trying to do. They are trying to take the ultimate control of the situation. A lot of these offenders are very controlling. And by taking their own lives and not providing answers to family members, to friends, to the detectives, they are taking the ultimate control.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, that's why I prefer to name my episodes after the victims and talk mostly about the victims. And this is the only episode I've done that is so killer centric. But as I said, people have been asking me for some insight about these one and done killers, and so that's why I consult experts like you. And thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on.
I appreciate you having me on. I think it was a great idea, and I would like to even talk more about it on my own show with my colleagues as well. So hear their thoughts too, because I know they would have some.
I'm very much looking forward to seeing as many of you as possible at CrimeCon 2025 in early September. Don't forget to use the coupon code DNAID to get 10% off the purchase of your standard admission badge, and come say hello on Podcast Row. Thanks for listening to this episode of DNA ID. Before you leave, please let me tell you about some important things related to the show. If you'd like to support this podcast and in the process, get access to early and ad-free episodes as well as bonus content like crime scene photos, you can sign up for a Patreon subscription for only $5 a month by heading over to patreon.com/DNAID. Of course, you're welcome to contribute more than $5 a month. We rely on Patreon funds to pay for the original source materials I use to research each episode. If Patreon isn't your thing, you can also show your support with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts. It costs just $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year. Your AbJack Insider subscription will give you the same benefits for not only DNA ID, but for all of the shows on the AbJack network, like Killer Communications and Campus Killings. Head over to Apple Podcasts and find the DNA ID page or look for the AbJack network to get started. If you're on social media, we'd love to interact with you there. DNA ID is on every major social media platform. Search your favorite platforms for DNA ID Podcast to find us. We also have a YouTube channel, and our website is dnaidpodcast.com. You can find links to all of these anytime in our show notes. If you need to reach the show, contact us by emailing dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. Finally, if you want to pick up some fun DNA ID merch and represent the show, visit the store at www.customizedgirl.com/s/DNA ID podcast. DNA ID is researched, written, and hosted by me, Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by me and Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Music by Connor Betancourt.